So, Ray, the question I want to ask you is that because you are the piano pedagogue extraordinaire, how do you view your first piano teacher in those terms?
Oh, wow.
Has anyone ever asked you that question
No,
before?
nobody's asked me that.
Yeah.
I started with a lady called Mavis Marshall. I was already 9 because my mother had taught me before that. And then I went to Loretta Cunningham, which some people may remember. She was the pianist for the NZSO in those early days. And I had, I think, 11 years with her. She was a great musician, and that was really great. In some ways, it wasn't until I got to London when I was, I think, 21, that I really started to learn about piano technique and how to play, how to make a good sound and all those things. And I think I was really lucky. I had fantastic teachers in the UK. One of them was Bridget Wilde, who was a Aotearoa. She'd studied with him for 9 years when she was growing up in Berlin. And then I went to Cyril Smith, who was a very wonderful piano teacher. And then following that, Maria Curcio, who taught all sorts of people, including people like Marta Eigerich used to go to her for
Yes.
odd lessons and so on. So they were an extraordinary three, actually. Maria was a student of Schnabel, Cyril Smith learnt with Rachmaninoff, and Bridget Wilde learnt with Aotearoa. So it was pretty nice.
Pedigree there.
Pedigree, yes, that's
But
right.
that's sort of jumping ahead. But going back to, you grew up here in Auckland, did you?
No, I grew up in Wellington.
Oh, you grew up in Wellington,
Yeah,
yes.
And
And your mother taught you the piano, and
She
was that
started,
was that an easy thing for your mother to do? Were
I-
you a good student?
No, I wasn't particularly. I used to say to my mother, come and have a battle with me, Mum, because I think, she was a bit of a hard taskmaster. She hadn't had the opportunity to learn when she was young, and she didn't start piano lessons until she was about 15. So when I was about 3, she was doing grade 8. I heard this music in the house, and my dad, he played anything he could get his hands on. So when he was a kid, again, he didn't have opportunity to learn. Somebody gave him a violin when he was about 10, and he strung it up the other way because he was left-handed. So he thought he could perhaps teach himself playing the other way around because it was sort of easier for him. And then somebody saw him playing, and they said, "Oh, he needs a teacher." And so he did a bit of violin. And then in the war, he bought a violin in Fiji. The violin sort of fell apart, so he stuck it together, and there was no hair on the bow, so he went and caught a horse and put the hair on, so he was a bit like that. And he also played flute and clarinet and oboe and anything he could teach himself. That was
Yes.
his passion.
Yes.
So I guess, I grew up into that rather deprived musical background with parents who were very keen that I had a better opportunity than they had.
And what music did you listen to at home?
Oh, well, my dad, he got a scholarship to go to America when I was about 3, 4, and he was working for RCA, and they gave him a lot of LPs. It was sort of part of, his farewell gift was this great big stack of LPs, and so we played those in the house a lot. So they would put them on in the evening. So I'd listen, to orchestras and things like that when I was growing up. I think that listening thing is really important for young people.
Yes. So not particularly piano?
No. It was probably more often, orchestral or, everything really. Or
Yes.
whatever was recorded by RCA, he sort of had this big package
Yes.
of LPs.
What a useful farewell present rather than the gold watch.
It was really great, actually.
That's amazing. So you were learning the piano in Wellington, and did you go to university in Wellington? Or
Yes, I did. But at that stage, I guess when I did grade 8, I got recommended for a Royal School Scholarship. But at that stage, I was 15, and my parents couldn't believe that I could go to London or something like that. It was like outside the realms of what they understood. And so I let that opportunity go. And just at that stage, then, once I got to university age, I was playing a lot, but I didn't do music at university. I was thinking I was going to be anything from a school teacher to a social worker to, save the world. I don't know. And I just did music alongside of everything else.
Looking back now, Ray, do you think that was actually a really enriching part of your career? Because as music students, we often sort of tend to go along the same path.
Yeah, I think with hindsight, what I should have done was to go to Auckland and study with Janetta McStay. That would have been a lot, if I knew what I was going to do.
Yes.
But I guess I didn't have any idea that you could really be a musician. And it wasn't really until I went to the Cambridge Music School, I think it was in the middle of the 60s sometime, and Juan Mateucci was there. And he heard me play and he said, I want you to play with the orchestra. And I thought, what do you mean play with the orchestra? I had no idea what he was talking about. And I thought, he must mean the youth orchestra, or, the back piano at the back of the youth orchestra. And so I didn't do anything about it. And then he called me up again. He said, look, I said I want you to play with the orchestra. I want you to do a Mozart concerto. And he was talking about the symphony orchestra.
New Zealand Symphony Orchestra.
New Zealand Symphony. And he gave one young person in each main centre, so Auckland, Wellington, Dunedin, Christchurch. He gave us all the opportunity to play, which was amazing. And about that same time, Claudio Rao came to New Zealand, and he rang me up and he said, I want you to come and play to a Rao. Well, I was out of my depth. I knew nothing about anything, really. And so I went to play to a Rao, and he gave me a terrific reference. And he said, well, you can come to my school in New York. And I thought, I can't go to New York, that feels really scary.
Yes.
And I said, well, at that stage too, I had a boyfriend who was going to London, and
yes.
So I wanted to go to London, and I said, well, who would you recommend in London? He said, well, you can go to my assistant, Bridget Wild. So that's how I got to London,
yes, really.
And it was because of a Rouse reference and, the concerto that I did with the MZ. So there were sort of things.
So which Mozart was it?
488.
Right.
A major.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful concerto.
Yeah, it was a fantastic opportunity.
Such a joyful piece.
Yeah,
yes.
Just, it's rather the whole of my early life just snowballed. I didn't really generate any of it. It just sort of came my way.
But do you think at that particular time in New Zealand, for people who were supremely talented like yourself, there were opportunities that were quite unique to New Zealand?
Perhaps. But when I look at the opportunities kids have now, they have masses of opportunities to perform, to do concertos, which, I had the one concerto I did, which was amazing. And I did it too with the Auckland Orchestra. I don't know what they were called then, I've forgotten. But because I won the Auckland Star Piano Concerto, which was at that time, and there you played with the orchestra as well. So I'd had two opportunities to play with an orchestra, but now kids have so many.
But were you one of those lucky Kiwis who recorded for Radio New Zealand?
I did before I left.
Yes, and that was a wonderful opportunity, wasn't it?
That's right. And then, of course, once I came back from England, I did masses and masses and masses of recordings. Yeah.
Yes, which is not really available now, that opportunity.
No.
Which is sad.
It is sad, yeah.
It's very sad.
It really is. It's a great shame, yeah.
So have you heard any of those early recordings that you did?
Well, to be fair, most of them don't exist because Radio New Zealand, of course, recorded on those great big sound tapes, which were very expensive. So they played the recordings twice and then they reused the tapes. And so there's almost nothing.
You've just told me something very wonderful. Because it's always a great fear that my early recordings will suddenly appear. I didn't know that about the recordings.
Tapes where I've recorded off the radio, but the quality's no good.
Yes, that's right.
So
holding the cassette player up to the radio to record it.
Exactly.
Yes, but they were wonderful times to be able to record. Yes,
they were,
because there was a local network and a national network.
Yes, indeed.
Yes,
fantastic.
yes.
Really.
So you went to London and you had these wonderful teachers. And did you always think that you would come back to New Zealand, or?
Pretty much. I think I was always a home girl, and I think by the time I'd been away 5 years, it was a bit in the balance. I was thinking, do I want to stay in the UK? Do I want to go home?
Yes.
And I came home for 3 months, and that kind of cemented it. I actually met my husband during that trip. So that kind of, again, it sort of snowballed into my coming back. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and apart from the lessons in London, what was the highlight for you living in?
I think being able to see and hear so much. I mean, I used to go to operas nearly every week. I used to go to everything I could possibly afford. I would spend more on my concerts than I would on my food.
Yes.
Or, because that was a real priority for me, just to listen. And, I'd queue up all night for Covent Garden and things like that. I mean, to get the cheap seats.
Yes.
And I think that experience of all-round musical education we hadn't really had here.
No.
We couldn't. we couldn't listen the same as kids can now. I mean, it's just all at their fingertips on the internet. They can hear everything.
Yes.
Whereas then you had to work it out for yourself.
Yes.
And I guess one of the things I did when I got to London was to get a job at the Wigmore Hall and get a job ushering, so I could hear all the concerts. And that was great.
Fantastic. And doesn't the Wigmore Hall have an atmosphere that is just...
It's really special.
So tell me, Ray, as a young New Zealander, when you went to London, how long before you felt at home there?
Oh, quite a long time.
Did it take you a while to...
It took me like... I'd never lived away from home.
Okay.
So that was a first big crunch, you know, that, you know, I think it's a big thing for people, and you have to grow up pretty fast.
Yes.
And I think it took me quite a while. Probably the first year was a bit up and down, and I got glandular fever after about a year. I think that was probably part and parcel of the stress that I felt, you know. And I think the other thing that was more difficult then was the communication. So you only had letters. Letters took a week to get to New Zealand and back another week. So that was 2 weeks. By then, whatever problem you had completely had changed.
That's right. But wasn't it exciting when you got a letter?
Oh, very exciting. Yeah, you lived for those letters, actually.
Yes, and phone calls were very few.
Phone calls you couldn't do because it cost a fortune. It cost about as much as your rent.
That's right, yes. And if there was a phone call, it was usually something was terrible had happened.
Yes.
So you came back to New Zealand and you had met your husband. And so what happened after there?
Well, then I started, because I got married pretty soon after I came back, and so I didn't have to make my own, I didn't have to survive.
Yes.
In the way that I would have if I'd come back as a single person.
Yes.
So I just started doing a bit of teaching and, wrote letters all over the place, and I started touring for Chamber Music New Zealand.
Right.
Did a lot for them. So I did solo concerts, I did various ensembles and schools concerts.
Yes.
And that was, I suppose, for the best part of 12 years or so that I did a lot of that until we came to Auckland, which was in 1990.
Right. And did you come to Auckland for your husband's job, or was it for...
Yes, he decided to go independent. He'd worked for TVNZ for a long time, and then he left TVNZ and decided he was going to be an independent filmmaker, and basically he was going to do yachting, because yachting at that stage was kind of in its early stages, and he was great friends with Peter Montgomery, who was our best man. I mean, that's how close they were. They were at school together.
Yes. And
so they formed a little company, and Bill started filming yachting, and then he started filming other sports, and then he went into music, filming more music. And so he then became an independent filmmaker. I think the move to Auckland was actually quite hard for us. It was certainly hard for me because in Wellington I was playing with all the NZSO guys, and had quite a busy performing life, about 100 concerts a year I was doing, so a lot. And then coming to Auckland felt a bit like a foreign country at that point.
Yes.
So it took me about as long to settle into Auckland as it did to settle into London, I think.
Okay. And at what point did you start teaching at the university?
Oh, that was quite a lot later.
Okay.
It was in the early 90s, and Thomas Vesmas went away on a sabbatical, and he'd been a Maria Curcio student, so I'd met him in London, and he was going on sabbatical and said, "Would you like to take my class?" So that was sort of the first part of it, and then
I bet you didn't actually hesitate.
I didn't hesitate at all. No, I didn't hesitate. I thought it was marvellous.
Yes.
And then I was invited to set up an accompanying course at the university, and that was in the 90s. I forget, middle of the 90s. But Brian Sayer and Thomas had those jobs, though there were no jobs.
Yes.
And so I started teaching this accompanying course, which I loved. And by that stage, I think I'd got more of a teaching practice in the community. I'd started to produce people that were doing well.
Yes.
And so all that snowballed. I actually did the Suzuki training. I was kind of interested in that because I had small children at the time.
Yes.
And I actually learned a lot from those guys in how to train the ear of young people, how to help them to practice, and how to get them to listen, all sorts of things I thought were good about that method. Not that I stuck to it, absolutely, but I found that quite interesting, and I got some very good results from the kids that went through there. And then I think it was really, I guess, as we move into 2000, when the university wanted to set up a junior school, an academy, and I was asked to direct that. So I did that for the next 5 years, and we had marvellous Saturdays where kids could do everything from chamber music to instrumental classes to general theory and musicianship, and there was an orchestra, and we grew that so there were about 120 kids on a Saturday that were coming through there, and many of them went on to university, which it was a very enriching time. It was really tough because I was very green when it came to university politics and how it all worked, and making a business plan and all that sort of thing I had absolutely no experience at. So yeah, that was, I guess, pretty important in the whole range of things. And I think through that time, we had a student, John Chen, who I taught from the time he was 7. And by the time he then went into the academy, and because of the academy, he was able to go to university when he was about, I think, 14. So he'd done his masters by the time he was 18, which I don't think's happened since. But it was just because he was so outstanding, and then he went on to win Sydney
Pinnacle. Yes.
But that was because of him and some of the others that I had at the time, that gradually, I started teaching more at the university. There was an overflow of students from Thomason and Brian, and so I started teaching some of them until I had sort of 9 or 10 students, which was of course quite a handful. And but when it came to a job, you see, I didn't have qualifications because I'd done a BA when I was, when I was in my teens. And then I went to London and did postgrad for 8 years, but there was no paper attached. So I had no postgrad degrees, done all the study, but no bits of paper. And it was Donna Morris that said to me, look, you're never going to get a university job until you upskill, because they won't look at you, it will just get thrown out. So I thought, okay. He said, well, by that stage, I'd actually had a plane-related injury. That happened 1993, soon after, not that long after we were in Auckland. I tried to fill you in about, but at that stage, I couldn't play anymore. And so Donna said, well, you'll have to upskill. Is there something else you can do other than playing? And I said, well, by that stage, I'd tried so hard to fix my own injury that I learned a lot about it, and people started coming to me with their injuries and started coming to me, and I usually could fix them or help them to get back to playing. And one of them had focal dystonia. That's probably the most devastating of musicians' injuries you could possibly get. And I knew at the time that Michael Houston had focal dystonia. And so I thought, well, this is an interesting research subject. So I said to Don, well, what about that? And he said, oh, sure, do that as a master's degree. You can do it at Massey. So I thought, yes, I'll do it at Massey. Then no one will know if I don't finish it. And so I called Michael up and I said, well, would you come and talk to me about your focal dystonia? And she said, sure, I'll talk to you with a tape recorder if you like. And so he came, and he came to Auckland and worked with a team of doctors, and I knew one of the doctors, partly because I'd had treatment from him. And so I knew Michael came once a month, and they all got round the table and they had dinner and they worked out how they could help him. And so I said, well, come and, what are they doing with you? And he showed me, and they had all sorts of tricks they were doing. They were tying bits of tape around things and making a splint and doing all sorts of things like that. And I sort of looked at him and I said, have you tried some of this? Have you tried some of that? And we had a piano, and I showed him some things that I thought might help. And he looked at me and he said, oh, I need to go on with this. And I said, well, great. Why don't you come to Auckland? We'll come for 2 weeks and we'll do something every day, because instinctively I knew that there was no change I could possibly help him with if we didn't do it regularly. If he came once a month, it would be gone. So he came, and by the time we'd worked about 4 days, we were starting to get some improvement. He at that time couldn't separate his third and fourth fingers. They would just go down together, boom, like that. And so we were starting to get some separation, and he got a bit excited. He said, "You better come and meet my doctors." So I went to dinner with them all, and they got awfully excited too. And one of them said, "You must video what you're doing. This is very exciting and very important work." So from then on, I took a video in, and I
did you leave that dinner on, just floating on cloud 99?
I was out of. I mean, again, I just couldn't really believe what was happening, and so one of the doctors at the dinner wanted piano lessons, and he said, "Well, can you teach me?" And I said, "Well, look," he had a Steinway, so he was sort of a serious medical person who loved music. And I said, "I'll tell you what, you help me with my research and I'll give you piano lessons." So that was the best thing that happened, because he then became my supervisor, and he was brilliant, because he helped me to make the thesis that I finally wrote, which turned into a PhD. He helped me to make it scientific, so that then it was something that could be verified and people could believe it.
Yes.
And so it was an important journey.
What an extraordinary story. I sort of loathe to ask, how did his piano playing progress?
What, the doctor?
Yeah.
Oh, he still comes occasionally. I mean, I told him you can have lessons for life,
Yes.
but he's got 3 little children now.
And he's a busy man. Yeah.
But he doesn't have so much time. But he still, he got very interested in it. He got very interested in the whole technical thing. I mean, he was a late starter, so he was, had lots of issues.
Yes.
So he was totally fascinated, because of course he read my thesis, and he kind of got the hang of what I was talking about from the inside. Yes. It was, great.
And tell me about Michael's progress.
Well, Michael was extraordinary. I mean, I think he's an extraordinary human being, full stop. And I think focal dystonia is something that people only rarely get over, because it's a neurological condition, and what happens with dystonia is that the brain pathways, usually connecting two fingers, or in Brasclaise it's the lips, but 2 fingers have got confused. It's a bit like, I've always used this analogy of a telephone cable with wires, and the wires kind of rub together till the casing's gone off, it's rubbed through, and so they're short-circuited. And it's a bit like that, which is why Michael couldn't separate his third and fourth fingers, because they were kind of fused together in the brain. And so you have to find a way to separate them, or to find new neural pathways. I don't quite understand whether that you separate what's there or you use different ones. It doesn't really matter. You have to change something or it doesn't get better. So you can't use the same movements as you've used before, because the same thing will happen. And so it has to be a new learning, I think. And so that was the core of my PhD, really. And I ended up having 6 different people that had dystonia that I worked with intensely. And then I had various ideas about prevention, which I also included, with really university students who would come with things that I felt were dangerous in their technique. You could sort of see that, that bit of incoordination needs to be dealt with, so I deal with it. And so I videoed a lot of that too. So I literally, my PhD's got 500 videos in it. It's enormous.
How extraordinary. And and tell me more about your teaching in recent time at the university.
Times. Well, the thing was, by then, by the early 2000s, I left the academy and I got a job as a full-time lecturer at the university. So I was sort of in my element, actually.
Yes.
I loved it. And gradually worked my way through till, I was eventually head of piano. But what I found was that because the university teaching year is quite short, a lot of students will come in with an enormous amount of tension that they've played in a certain way for 10 years, and often that way of playing can lead to injuries. And we had a lot of students drop out at various stages of the course with pain or injury, And I thought, I just don't want to be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. How much better if we can stop people getting injured in the first place. And I think, the way that people traditionally taught piano came out of harpsichord playing, and it came out of a very light keyboard. I mean, we're talking centuries back. And when the piano was invented, it became much heavier, and people were still just playing with their fingers. And I mean, Liszt started to use his whole body, but it wasn't widely taught. And people, even when I was learning piano when I was a kid, they were still just focused on the fingers. There was no idea that you actually used the whole body. And so with my kind of research, one of the things I did was to go around the world and interview great pedagogues on their piano technique and what they did, what they believed in, which was wonderful, gave me a lot of resource. And then I wanted to stop the university students getting injured, but how could I do that when I only taught a certain number of them? So I devised a set of exercises which I felt covered the major movements that we need if we're going to play well. Starting with big gestures, starting with using the whole arm as a unit, not just fingers, because most of them can move their fingers.
Yes.
And so my mission was to stop the tension from building up. And so over the years, there's a little sequence of 10 or so exercises. We assessed them because otherwise the students wouldn't do them. And so once we started doing that, it then became a common language that all teachers bought into. And it gave us something to use in the class that was common to everyone. And the injury rate just dropped right down, which has been fantastic to see. And then, of course, after that, I thought, well, I need to help a bigger range of people, not just this little university island that we've got here. And so I've put the ideas into a book which is called Fit for Piano. And so that contains, in the simplest way that I can do, these major movements that I believe are relevant whether we're playing Twinkle Star or whether we're playing a Bartok concerto. And so that's why I think the book is relevant to every level, and I find I use it a lot in my own teaching because it's full of video. It's an electronic book.
Oh, okay. Right.
And so all the exercises are filmed and can be scanned with QR codes, or else there's a whole electronic version. You can just click and upload the video. And I show how this particular exercise is relevant in various levels of repertoire. So that book has gone, I mean, we've sold thousands around the world now. And I think teachers are finding it helpful, I hope.
Yes.
And so from then on, I've gone on and made an online course, which is in much more depth and a little bit more geared towards more advanced students. So those two things I think have been, and now we've just actually, we're about to publish a set of etudes which have been written by 12 New Zealand composers.
So actually you've got a copy of that there. So
yeah, this is the Fit for Piano book.
Yeah, can you just hold it up a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
That's right. Yeah.
And basically it's full of nice pictures, because I think that kids like nice pictures, and it sort of gives them something that they can relate to. So my exercises have silly names like trampoline bouncers or shaking or sweeping. There are various ones that I've used, and so therefore it's relevant whether you're teaching a 6-year-old or a 60-year-old, or something in between.
And so where's that book available from?
It's available from our website, from Fit for Piano website.
Right, so that's the website. Yeah, very good. And the other book there you've got with the attractive picture on it.
This is actually, it's not in its finished form yet, but these are the
just back a little bit. Yeah, I want to get that in.
The 12
there we go.
etudes that have been written by 12 New Zealand composers. So I got funding from Creative New Zealand. And I said to the composers, here's an exercise, here's a technique, and I showed them the videos, and I said, please write a 1 to 2 minute etude based on that movement. Yes. And so we've got these 12 terrific pieces.
Isn't that great?
I'm really thrilled with them. Yeah.
Isn't that an extraordinary way to actually commission composers to write that?
It was really lovely,
Yes.
and you know, because some of them really got into it.
Yes.
And said, "Oh, I've been doing this rotation. Oh, I
Yes.
like it. Oh,
Yes.
I'm going to,
Yes.
you know." And it was quite fun, actually.
Yes.
That communication.
Because sometimes when a composer is given a brief like that, it sort of really, it's fun, isn't it? You know, to
Yes.
opens up something they hadn't thought of before.
Yes, and you know,
Yes.
quite several of them said, "Look, I want to make sure I'm on the right track. Can we have a video call? You know, so
Yes.
we'd have a video call.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
I'd show them some things on the piano,
Yes.
and then they'd go away and, you know,
Yes.
modify their piece or whatever.
So
they-
they're those two books, but I just have a feeling, Ray, there's probably another one brewing in the mind.
Well, could be. I must say I haven't quite got there
Yes.
yet, but I mean, there's quite a lot to do with those two resources.
Yes.
And you know, I'm starting to get some Facebook posts out there and little bits
Yes.
of video,
Yes.
just things that crop up. And you know, I just want to have a bit more time to put some of these ideas out there. Just yesterday I was teaching this particular piece,
Yes.
and this was the problem, and this is how we fixed it.
Yes.
That sort of thing. And I think there's an awful lot of that to be done. So you know, I want to do some videos on how to apply. It's not really a method, but how to apply these movements to these particular pieces.
Because a music lesson is a very private thing, really, isn't it? I mean, it's the teacher being remarkably creative, because and then there's the student who hopefully is being remarkably receptive, but not necessarily, you know. But it's wonderful if you can find a way of sharing your great
Yes.
experience, and it makes you more of a creative teacher too, doesn't it?
Well, one of the things that I really love is when teachers come with a group of students
Yes.
and say, "Look, here's," and then they watch. And
Yes.
then you feel you're actually reaching a lot of people.
Yes.
You know, if you help the teachers, then the teachers can then help their students.
Yes, that's
And,
right.
you know, that's my mission in life, really, with the energy that I've got left.
Yes, and energy you have a lot of. So and playing the piano for you now?
Well, strangely enough, I mean, I tried everything. I had a massive overuse injury. I was asked to play the Shostakovich Second Piano Concerto at 3 weeks' notice, and I hadn't learnt it. And so I thought, oh yeah, I'm Superwoman. I can learn it in time. I'll get that done. You know, I had to play it later in the year, so I thought, yes, I'll do that. And I practiced it like a maniac, sort of 6 hours a day to get it done. But at the time, my octave technique wasn't that great, and there's a lot of octaves in Shostakovich too. And I suddenly felt something really sort of go bang in my wrist, and I thought, whoa, what have I done? And I went the following day to have some Feldenkrais treatment, and actually my whole system just revolted, and I just had pain from the waist up, and completely couldn't really lift anything. I just lost all my strength. And that went on. I tried everything to get better. I tried every kind of traditional and non-traditional therapy. I went to Australia, I went down to Christchurch, I went all over it. I mean, I was madly passionate about getting better, but it just didn't happen. And what happened to me eventually was that I couldn't play for more than 40 minutes without setting off this pain reaction, which went through my entire body. So I couldn't just work through it because everything would give up. And what in fact I had was chronic pain, but back in the 90s, people didn't understand chronic pain. And so they would go on treating all the symptoms that I had, which would move around. I mean, sometimes they'd be here, sometimes they'd be in the shoulder, sometimes they'd be in the back. And so the treatments were doing absolutely no good. They'd alleviate that particular symptom, but they wouldn't solve the fact I couldn't play for more than 40 minutes. So I reluctantly gave it away after having treatments, I think, for 7 years. It was a long time. But that taught me an enormous amount. I learnt a lot about all the therapies, I learnt a lot about people's ideas with them, but what they didn't understand then was chronic pain. And chronic pain is a little bit like focal dystonia in that it's neurological. And so what I had practiced passionately and intensely was that after 40 minutes I was going to have my body collapse on me. I'd practiced it really well, and that's what happened. And so, interestingly enough, about 8 years ago, I had a bout of cancer, which fortunately I got through, and it's all clear, no repercussions at all. But while I was recuperating, I started playing a bit more, and I was getting up to about an hour, and my son-in-law who's principal cello of the NZSO, he said, well, why don't we do something? You and me together, we can maybe record some songs.
Yes.
I've always wanted to do songs for cello.
Yes.
So I thought, yeah, maybe I could do that. And the interesting thing about it was that once I started trying to practice for longer in order to prepare these songs, my body collapsed again. And I thought, this is crazy. This is just not logical. It's been 15 years, it's not, can't be. And so I went on a course, it was an online course about chronic pain, and I learned some tricks about what to do with it. And so I applied these tricks, and by the end of our recording, I was fine. I'd actually solved it. But it was to me fascinating that it came back like that. It's like the body doesn't forget. And but I'm fine now. I can play again. Yeah, I mean, I'm not playing much, but I can play enough.
That's a wonderful way to finish the interview. Thanks so much, Rae. Extraordinary story. Thank you.